Welcome to the Mindful Academy podcast with me, Jennifer Askey. I'm a professional certified coach and academic workplace consultant. On this podcast, I talk about doing well personally so that you can perform well professionally. I talk about intentional career planning and about how to get out of your own way and align yourself with success. Thank you for joining me. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Mindful Academy. I am Jennifer Askey, your coach. And in this episode, I'm going to follow up on my last episode on imposter syndrome and provide a little bit more room, fodder for thought and discussion. So as I think I mentioned in the previous episode, I am doing 3 one-hour open discussions on imposter syndrome for academic impressions, one in April, one in June, and one in August. So if you or your institution are members of academic impressions for professional development, you are welcome to attend. So the first of these hour-long sessions was held a couple weeks ago in April, and over 400 people registered for it. And it was an hour long, so it's super short, and we weren't going to record it because it's a tender topic. And 400 people registered, 420. And almost 200 people showed up. And I'm smiling as I say that because, first of all, I'm incredibly pleased when a topic resonates with people. And also because it points those registration numbers, which are out of the norm, beyond crazy big for anything that Academic Impressions does, whether with me or anybody else. And those numbers point to a really interesting tension in the notion of imposter syndrome. So the language, the verbiage, imposter syndrome, right? Syndrome is a pathology. It's a disorder that exists on a spectrum, and you can have a severe case or a mild case. It's not very scientific language, but things that are syndromes show up in different ways for different people. So it is kind of a way to acknowledge that not everybody has the exact same presentation of imposter syndrome. But the pathologizing nature of the word syndrome does, I think, reinforce the notion that whatever is going on psychologically, emotionally, is yours to deal with. Like it's your particular variant of imposter syndrome, and you need to get that fixed on your own, or adapt to it on your own, or address it in an individualistic way because it's a unique to you situation. Even if you are not thinking all of those things as you say imposter syndrome, the wording carries that baggage and that connotation with it. And so the extreme individualization and pathologization of syndrome kind of gets negated when 400 plus people sign up to talk about it. So I want us just to begin by saying, like, okay, fine, this is not an individual me thing. This is an us thing. This is a systemic thing. I want to share some of the insights from the chat discussion that we had in that session with you to give, to sort of fill out the picture of what people say they're thinking about when they think about imposter syndrome, how people identify the way imposter syndrome shows up for them. And I'm going to keep using imposter syndrome because I think it's the most common term that we have. Research has suggested that we talk about imposter phenomenon or a feeling of being a fraud or something like that, which I'm more than happy to contemplate that, but imposter syndrome rolls off my tongue because that's how it's been written and talked about for quite a while. So the chat was pretty vibrant, and in a minute I'll just read some things from the chat that I shared, but I want to pull out a couple themes first. So I mentioned that the roots of the articulation of this phenomenon, and that is what they called it, the imposter phenomenon, go back to 1978 and a landmark study of professional women. So women who in the late 70s were probably newly entering the workforce, achieving some sort of professional status and grappling with that and feeling like imposters. And because this is late 1970, these are white women with educations, right? So it's a pretty narrow slice of the workforce, a pretty narrow slice of women in America, and they're white and educated. And so we know, like baked into the definition of imposter syndrome is the notion of gender or gender expression, that being a woman in a male workplace is likely to trigger feelings of imposter-ness, imposterhood, imposterdom. We're going to go with imposter-ness. So it's part of the gender is part of the initial framework. The framework has been expanded. Literature recognizes that just about anybody can feel imposter phenomenon. But in the chat, the 200 people who were there brought up specifically race. Like, are there studies that break it down by race and gender? There may well be. I did not find them on my initial search. I could go digging a bit deeper. Another characteristic that triggers imposter syndrome for some people is age. Whether in the guise of ageism, you're too old, you should be home knitting, or ageism in the other direction, you're too young, how on earth did they let you in the door, right? Another factor that contributes to feeling like an imposter can be neurodiversity, right? Are there norms in my workplace or norms in my discipline when it comes to ways of interacting and speaking that don't feel comfortable for me? And so I perpetually feel like an outsider, like somebody who doesn't belong, like somebody who should be excluded from this group. And another topic another contributing factor that came up for several people, because this was a group of not just faculty members, but university employees. There were some graduate students, so staff, graduate students, faculty, like all manner of people affiliated with universities showed up. And somebody pointed out, like, I don't have as many letters after my name as other people. And somebody else chimed in, well, I have a master's degree, but I don't have a PhD. So I don't even want to talk about my master's degree because it's not a PhD and I'm ashamed, right? So that comparative, what is the standard? Am I meeting it? And in an institution of higher education, one of those standards might be what kind of education you have. Where did you get it? Or how long ago was it? Right? So we have gender, we have race, we have age, we have neurodiversity, we have class. Are you first generation, right? Do you know how the system works? Do you understand how to do this, that, and the other thing? And how long have you been a part of the system? How many letters do you have after your name? So all of those things came up as like, oh yeah, this contributes to. So again, if any of or all of those ring true for you, take note, you are not alone. A couple other things that came up that I think are worth pointing out when it comes to why we should address imposter syndrome. That's sort of where I'm headed next. Because I ask people, like, what is going on around you when you feel at your most imposteriness? And several people talked about, group scenarios on committees, in working groups, in collaborative environments, where the freedom to speak and to think out loud and contribute, where they self-curtail that because they're worried about how their ideas will be taken, whether they will say something foolish, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you couple that with most human beings' fear of public speaking, several people articulated this toxic knot of, I'm afraid of public speaking. I have a little bit of insecurity about my job that shows up as imposter syndrome. When I put those two things together, I don't contribute. I don't put myself forward. I don't interview well. And so you feel maybe inadequate. As a result, you engage in behavior that is going to not get you any further, therefore reinforcing the notion of inadequacy. So people were identifying, like, this is a pretty vicious circle that if you If you are feeling the imposter phenomenon and you behave as if that is real, what happens is you create that reality. You create or reinforce a reality where people don't come ask you for your expertise, where your opinion isn't sought out, where you don't speak much in public, where people think you don't have anything to say because you don't speak up in public, where you don't put your work out there and therefore don't get published, therefore your career is rockier, right? So we can create the result that we fear by acting as if it has already happened. And several people articulated that as well. Another theme that came up that's connected to that is the notion of comfort zone. That several people, and this really resonated for me, articulated that like in certain areas of their life or work, they don't feel imposter syndrome. But as they enter new levels of responsibility, as they take on new projects, as they pivot into new areas and are again a beginner, or they feel like they drop a few rungs down when it comes to expertise, those feelings come rushing back. And in order to avoid those feelings of the imposter, several people say, oh, I struggle and I might prefer to stay in my comfort zone because I do feel very much up to the task here. And I know that if I took on more, if I interviewed for that next position, or if I volunteered for the next big project, I would be inviting imposter syndrome in the guise of professional insecurity. And am I up to this particular task? And the reason I want to point that out is because I, as a person and as a coach, am very committed to the notion that we don't need to ever stop growing. That I, in my 50s, will be a more self-aware and more self-actualized person than I was in my 40s. That in my 50s, I will be a more empathic and compassionate friend and companion and coach than I was in my 20s, maybe even 5 years ago, right? So that for me, I'm very invested in what is my growth edge as a human. In addition to whatever knowledge I'm acquiring, in addition to whatever subject matter expertise I want to become proficient in, how am I growing as a person? And so when I think about the way imposter syndrome, as articulated by people in this session a couple of weeks ago, how the fear of imposter syndrome or the scars of having dealt with it before, how people from putting themselves out there in that uncomfortable growth zone so that they can become a more self-aware, a more empathic, a more self-actualized human being. Because growth helps us get to know ourselves in new ways. And then we work on those growth edges and then that thing becomes comfortable and then we move into the next thing. But if you hold yourself back out of fear of imposter syndrome, okay, you're not going to do the work that you could do if you were willing to go out on a limb, but you also don't reap either the career or the personal benefits of being the person who does that work, being the person who goes up the competency ladder to the top. And I'll explain the competency ladder in case you're not familiar with it. So the competency ladder has 4 steps to it, 4 rungs. The bottom rung is unconscious incompetence. So this is, I don't know anything here. And I know so little that I don't even know that I don't know anything. Like, I don't even know there's a field over there to know things about. That is how incompetent I am. And there's no judgment attached to this, to any of these words. There's competence in terms of knowing something, having incorporated it into your self-concept and being able to use it. So let's say interview skills. 12-year-olds are probably unconsciously incompetent in conducting good interviews, right? Because they've never had to do it before. The notion of an interview is probably incredibly far from their mind. So if they were to encounter, let's interview people, they would go from unconscious incompetence. I'm just out here talking to people with no thought to if it might be an interview or how I might get information from people, because I'm not using that framework. So they move from that unconscious incompetence to the second rung, which is conscious incompetence. So here you've learned a skill or a concept, and you are very aware, maybe even hyper aware, that you are practicing that skill insufficiently, imperfectly. So maybe you have flashcards. Yeah, in fact, learning languages offers a number of parallels, right? Unconscious incompetence. I know Japanese exists, but that's all. So I cannot speak Japanese, and I don't even know how much I don't. Were I to start learning Japanese, I would enter slowly into conscious incompetence, which is, I'm still not very good at this, and I'm super aware of it. So maybe I have some crutches, some flashcards, some things to help me out, because I cannot rely on rote memory. I can't rely on being really proficient at this. So I am incompetent, but consciously aware of that gap. The third step in the ladder is conscious competence. So this is where you've learned the concept and you work with it pretty well, but you still like reach into the toolbox to pull it out. Right? You still like, so let's say giving a presentation is one of the things that you're feeling impostery about. Before you knew you had to give presentations, when you were just talking to people, you were unconsciously incompetent. Then perhaps you became consciously incompetent in grade 6 when you had to give book reports and you realized that you didn't really like standing in front of the room and it made you all sweaty, and right. And so then you're like, oh no, there's a gap here. Here's an expectation and I'm really far from meeting it. That awareness. Then you get to undergrad and you've practiced it maybe painfully often enough that when you have to give a presentation, you have steps to follow, maybe some routines, you have a nice formula, and you can say, okay, oh, now is the right time to use this. So you know what to do, you know when to do it, but it requires a little bit of follow-up on your part. So whether you keep notes for yourself or flashcards, some kind of crutch system to help you out. And the top rung of this ladder is unconscious competence, where whatever this skill is just a part of who you are. You don't have to think about when it's the right skill to use. You don't have to think about the steps in the skill. You don't have to think about anything. It just is part of you and flows through you. And in listening to the people in this open session talk with one another, with me in the chat about their feelings of imposteriness, I very much was reminded of this ladder of competency, because I think that imposter syndrome is at its loudest in those two conscious levels, right? Where you realize, oh, here's a thing I should be doing, and I'm not doing it yet, or I don't know it yet. I'm not super proficient in it yet. And you're aware of that. Whether you judge yourself incompetent or competent in that thing, your awareness of where the potential gap is between some sort of ideal and your own behavior or your own ability with a concept. And that's where imposter syndrome like rears its ugly head and comes and attacks. Because when you are unconsciously incompetent, you're not worried about it. And when you're unconsciously competent, it's just part of you and you're not worried about it. And if we see in work environments if we see people who are at the unconscious competence level of deploying a skill or using a concept or whatever, we see that gap really clearly, and imposter syndrome flares up. And I want to pair that, this competency ladder, with the notion of the growth mindset, that just because you are consciously incompetent now, or maybe you are just gaining conscious competency, just because you're there right now, doesn't mean that you're not very much on the path to unconscious competency, right? But your belief in your ability to continue to grow, your belief in your own neuroplasticity, in practice makes permanent, your belief in your own diligence is critical to recognizing that imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon, maybe I'm feeling it today, I will not be feeling this way forever because I'm conscious of this stuff, and here's something that I'm working on in order to move closer to mastery there. But when we become aware of the gap between where we are and where the other guy is, or what the ideal is, and those are in scare quotes too, then we have ample opportunity to judge ourselves in some way, shape, or form deficient. So leaving your comfort zone where maybe you are unconsciously competent and entering a new zone where you are conscious of the gap is a prime time for imposter syndrome to show up, but it is also the way that you grow, right? It's the way that you acquire new competencies, acquire new skills. It's the way you become the person who is unconsciously competent in a new thing. Like, this isn't the Matrix. They can't just plug a new program, thank God, because that was kind of gross, into the back of your skull and automatically make you unconsciously competent in the next thing you need to be able to do or embody or inhabit in order to reach the next level of authority, of the next level of leadership, the next level of scholarly contribution, right? There's a little bit of discomfort in becoming the person who reaches that next level, because there's a little bit of discomfort in grappling with that conscious incompetence and conscious competence. And so I hope that was clear, and I hope that was useful, because that is certainly something that I see a great deal in my one-on-one coaching with people, is what happens when we decide that we want a change and we want to grow, is that our minds will instantly offer up all of the ways that it won't work, or that it's a colossally bad idea, or what have you, because we are leaving our comfort zone of unconscious competence for a zone where we are conscious of the gap between where we are now and where we need to be. A couple other things that came up a few times had to do with luck. So this was particularly around professional accomplishments. Oh, they had a crappy hiring pool, so they hired me. Race intersects here too. Ooh, am I the diversity hire? Am I a token? Right? That's shitty. And so you're going to feel, or you run the risk of feeling like you don't belong if that's your mindset. I'm not that special. Why did they hire me? Tons of people could do this job. So-and-so over there could do this job better than I can. I am not special. So there's luck and other people's misfortune, and there's you not being special. Like, all of those things are part of imposter syndrome as well. So I don't want to say I hope you recognize yourself in some of those things, because I don't wish imposter syndrome on anybody. I imagine that some of these things have resonated with you. And if they haven't, I will read a few more in a minute. But I want to talk about what we do, or what you can do when you recognize, oh, okay, so imposter phenomenon is a thing in my life, and I don't think it's serving me. What do I do next? So the first thing is you recognize that there are things within your scope of control that you can do, and that the circumstances you're in, if the circumstances you're in at work, at university, at home, encourage you to feel like you do not belong, to feel like you are not worthy of belonging, then all of the work that you do on managing your own mind around this, it will be much harder. Right? So are you in an environment that wants you to succeed and wants you to be a part of communal success? Or are you in an environment that really wants you to constantly doubt and question yourself so that you'll work harder, so that you won't hype up when things are unfair, like whatever the reasons that organizations might have for thinking that, oh, keeping the fear alive in people is a really good motivator. So even though we use the language of syndrome, which implies that it is yours to solve individually, let's acknowledge that there's a context in which this is occurring. Somebody in the chat said, well, I can feel like an imposter at work, but when I go running, when I run a half marathon, I feel like a rock star. Okay, so that person's evidently super fast and quite successful and can trust their body to do what they want it to do. And then they go to work and some of that self-trust and feeling like a rock star falls away. So let us take into account context and see, is your context rooting for your better self? Or is your context kind of rooting for your inner critic? And recognize that even as you employ some of these tactics that are designed to turn the volume down on imposter syndrome. So one strategy I want to talk about is reframing. And I did some of this in the session, and people in the chat offered some of their own reframes. So a reframe is, I say something negative and you offer me something that is also true, but positive. So you're not denying that I have a negative insight, but you're offering me how that thing can also be true, but not necessarily negative. And so the simple question of what else could be true is a powerful question to ask yourself or to ask other people when you see or hear them deep in the throes of imposter syndrome. If they're saying, I'm not good enough, I'm going to fail at this, I don't know why they hired me, they're going to find out I'm a fraud, like whatever it is, waiting for the other shoe to drop. If you offer them what else could be true, and then help them see, okay, how are you better, more capable, more advanced? How have you grown in the last 2 years, in the last 5 years? How are you more capable now than you were 5 years ago, right? That's one thing that could maybe elicit the what else is true. There's also, oh gosh, the only reason I got hired is because there was a really shallow and crappy applicant pool. And so I was the best of a crappy bunch. And somebody offered the reframe. Okay. And also, you put your name in the hat. You put the work in. You were persistent. You showed up for the interview, right? You did all the right things. It's a bit like the reverse of that cartoonish argument around modern art, where somebody goes to a modern art gallery and sees something Jackson Pollock-like and is like, my kid could do that. Yeah, but your kid didn't, right? So-and-so could do this job so much better than me. Yeah, but they're not here today. So that kind of a reframe, but with a real spirit of generosity around, how did you create the reality here through your actions? How did you contribute to your own luck? As opposed to, oh, the universe just decides what it's going to do with me, and it gave me this job, but not because I'm special or I deserved it, just because that was what the pool looked like on the day that they interviewed. Like, well, how did you help the universe make that decision? What's the persistence and the pre-work and the practice and the networking and the hustling that you did that helped you be ready to take advantage of that luck? Right? So that's one kind of reframe. Another reframe is what went right. And frequently when we're offering feedback to others or feedback to ourselves, and let's concentrate on ourselves here for a minute, is we start with, excuse that yawn, we start with how far from the ideal was that? What went wrong? And our brains have a negativity bias, things that make us afraid or feel guilt or shame, or feel physically uncomfortable. All of those things our brain like amplifies and holds on really tightly to, because it is important to know, oh, that thing makes me feel shitty. And I don't like feeling shitty, so I'm going to stop doing that thing, right? That's the basics of the negativity bias. Every time I hear that noise, I see a snake behind the bush that's going to bite me. So now I'm afraid of that noise and I avoid it. But maybe sometimes you hear that noise and it's just the wind, right? But we're going to hold on to that one time that we saw a snake. We're going to make it every time we saw a snake, and that's what we're going to remember. So reframing is really important in order to turn down the volume on our negativity bias and not just spray paint what went wrong all over the place, right? So instead of what went wrong, what went right? Now, this is connected with the notion of gratitude, because you can have a gratitude practice where every day you ask yourself what went right. And, you know, whether or not you're a fan of Gretchen Rubin, her happiness project, and some of the research conducted around gratitude. I record these in the afternoon when I'm feeling a little snoozy. That the research around gratitude shows that like people who do the gratitude practice are more content. So what happens if you start asking yourself after every presentation, after every project, after every semester, after every article, what went right? How might that build up self-trust? Oh, look, I have a track record of what went right. I have a track record of doing the right thing, of getting the right result. Look, because I reflect on this on a regular basis. And then somebody in the chat asked, what if gratitude along those lines? What went right if that feels indulgent? It's like, wow, okay. So if you are in a place where you can't celebrate what went right, like that is a very big self-compassion debt that you are working under, right? So recognizing that saying what went right, what did I do well? What did the team do well? How was that process amazing? It doesn't mean that everybody gets a trophy. It means we focus on the things that work and make note of them and even clap a little bit, because we need to keep track of those so that we can do them again. Keeping track of what went wrong, I mean, doing a blameless postmortem can be important so that you say, okay, this could have been a lot better. How did it go off the rails? How are we going to improve it next time? But even that is called a blameless postmortem, because you're not supposed to attach blame to any one person or one office or one job. It's just an understanding that the process went off the rails in certain places. How are we going to improve from that? So paying attention to the negative at all times, like, oh, there's that danger over there. There's that danger over there. There's that risk over there. I have a friend who used to be, well, I think she still is a leadership consultant, but she used to be a ski instructor. And she said, doing that, like paying attention to the negative chatter in your head and listening to it and brooding over it and ruminating on that and focusing on all of the ways in which you see that gap between where you are now and where you'd like to be. It's like learning how to ski and looking downhill at the trees. Because what you stare at when you're on skis is what you're gonna aim towards. So you're basically just aiming towards the trees and you're gonna like bash into them. So if we pay attention to what went right, it offers us the opportunity to aim more in the direction of what went right. The third, okay, so there's reframing, and there are zillions of examples of reframing, and those are few. I want to pivot now to a different practice that you can engage in that can, over time, drastically turn down the volume on the imposter syndrome. And that's the notion of compassion and grace. The first thing I want to point out is that when you are feeling imposter syndrome, you are not alone. And I'm reinforcing that. I'm saying it again because this is important to recognize. So here I'm going to read a little bit. I have a big feeling of someday they will find out I'm not as good as they think I am. I don't feel like anything I do is good enough, regardless of the positive feedback I receive. As a younger employee, I often worry that it's clear I'm inexperienced and also not very knowledgeable. I second guess my thoughts, even though I'm the subject matter expert. And then I question if I'm communicating well. Everyone else in the room is smarter than I am. When I want to put myself up for leadership on a project, I doubt others will recognize my skills or will realize that I don't have them. I also worry that I'm going to say something and sound dumb and be told that I don't belong in that space. I feel like people have just picked me to fill in slots, and one day they're going to decide that I'm not qualified enough or not as good as they once thought. When I do great things at my job, I don't like to receive recognition because I feel like I don't deserve it. And then I feel my coworkers judge me for doing well. So then I lay low and I don't mention my success. And I could go on. Those were insights from the first 2 of 6 pages of the chat transcript from the Zoom call, and not like the actual chat transcript, but me cutting and pasting actual sentences that people said. 6 pages of just comments like that. So if you are feeling anything like that, whether now or yesterday or in a week, what happens when you expand your metaphorical vision, right? From past the tip of your nose out sideways, so that you are taking in people next to you, people behind you, people in front of you. And you think, how many people in this room, right, have felt this way before? And the answer is some of them, guaranteed, if not every single person, right? Anywhere from 6 to 86% of people, depending on the study you look at, self-report feeling this way. So let's work with 50% of the people in that room will have felt this way. And your irritation with individual humans aside, for how many of those 50% would you say, you don't belong here? You're too young to be here. You're too old to be here. I don't know where you got your degree, but it was probably Willy Wonka's chocolate factory of diplomas. You know, we thought we were hiring a really, really great candidate, but it turns out you're pretty crappy. Like, who would you say that to? You're not going to say that to people. You probably don't believe it about people. Like maybe there's a human you know who has gotten into the wrong job by potentially faking their credentials or knowing the right people or whatnot. But that doesn't apply to you. You didn't fake your credentials, and you didn't just network your way into your job. Networking is important for getting jobs, but you didn't just network your way into a job. You have qualifications. I don't know most of you personally. I am assuming each and every one of you is qualified. And we tend to assume that the people we work with are competent. And when we discover, oh, they didn't do that very well, do we make it a blanket indictment of them as a human being? Because how we speak about and treat others is the surest indication of what our self-talk is doing to us. So if you feel particularly critical and judgy towards others, take that sense and like multiply it by a dozen, and that's how you're talking to yourself. Because that judgment that we give to others is very much a mirror we are holding up. And by the same token, if when I say, oh yeah, we shouldn't have hired so-and-so, basket case, doesn't belong here, got her diploma from Willy Wonka's chocolate factory of PhDs, and you say, wow, that's harsh, unfounded, rude, don't talk about people like that. There's your indication that you should also not talk about you like that. What is your self-talk doing? And if you look around you, if you expand your vision to take in your community in any given space, and know that at least half of them have felt imposter syndrome at some point or another, and that you would be unlikely to kick them while they're down, and that you, if asked, would be able to find their strengths, then take that and apply it to yourself and say, oh, we're all in the same boat. And how I treat me is going to be how I treat my fellow human. And so in order to extend grace to others, in order to extend compassion to others, I need to extend that to myself first. And I'll just offer that if we had the practice as people who work in higher education of extending grace to others, of being generous with our human assessment of others, of our trust of others, how that might result in a more delightful place to work and be productive. But recognizing that your misery, whether it is of short duration, of long duration, whether you caused it or somebody else caused it, your misery is shared misery. It is not yours alone. And so as you look at people around you and think, wow, they have a part of my unhappiness. They have a part of my fear. They have a part of my guilt or my shame or my imposter syndrome. And I want to treat them, even if it's only in my own heart and mind, generously and kindly, because that will help me treat myself generously and kindly. And this for me represents a softening. I think that when imposter syndrome thrives, it thrives in environments that are either incredibly rigid or incredibly vague, right? So you can't know what success looks like. So what happens if we soften that rigidity and we replace rigidity and vagueness with generosity? What does that do for you as a person when it comes to confronting your own imposter syndrome? What does recognizing the extent to which humans experience this allow you to soften towards yourself and towards others in a way that opens up more space for work, for creativity, for contribution? So reframing and empathy and compassion are, and growth mindset, there you go. Those are the three heavy hitters. I think I mentioned some of them last time. I could probably redo this every other week because It is such a prevalent topic. So one more takeaway, sort of the final summation here, is if I survey these 6 pages of just extracted sentences from the chat, what rises to the top for me is imposter syndrome shows up for a lot of people as a feeling of not belonging or a question mark around belonging. And then the story people tell themselves, and maybe the story has been made very available to you to just tap into, is, oh, well, maybe I'm not worthy of belonging. I am different, therefore I am inadequate. I don't look or feel like I think these people look or feel, therefore I am not worthy to belong. And that story we tell ourselves about, like, ooh, I'm kind of uncomfortable here, we make it about our worthiness. And that gives rise to sort of the biggest, scariest, loudest versions of imposter syndrome, instead of making it about maybe where we are on the competency ladder and making it about growth. Right? I think those are 2 very different ways of approaching this. So that's one takeaway. The other takeaway is self-doubt is not your friend. And I know that in some, especially in some academic environments, there's this notion that fear motivates and pressure motivates. And I'll just say that if fear and pressure come with a side order of, are you sure you can do this? What if you F it up? That just like staring at the trees when you're heading downhill skiing, focusing on self-doubt and giving a lot of mental real estate to self-doubt is not going to help you overcome the things about which you are worried. However, if in place of that self-doubt, you remind yourself of why you can have trust in yourself, your track record of good decisions, your track record of completion, your track record of success, then you're aiming in a more productive direction. So giving imposter syndrome less real estate in your mind is my second takeaway. I hope this was interesting for you. If you want more, if you have questions, get in touch, Jennifer@jenniferaskey.com, and LinkedIn, other places. Please come find me. I'd love to talk more about this. I would love to talk to you about this. If you would like to bring me into your institution or organization to talk about imposter syndrome, how it shows up, and how you can individually and collectively fight back, get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. Take care, and I will see you next time on the Mindful Academy. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mindful Academy podcast. For questions about this episode, suggestions for future episodes, or to request a consultation with me, email me at jennifer@jenniferaskey.com. This episode was recorded in Edmonton, Alberta on Treaty 6 lands. The songs included in the intro and outro for this podcast are Heartache by Silent Partner and Piano Store by Jimmy Fontanez of Media Right Productions, both sourced through the audio library. Thank you so much for listening.